Snow began with a whisper. Not the bold, theatrical kind that slaps against windows, but the secretive kind, flakes drifting sideways like they had someplace important to be, landing soundlessly on the thatched roof of Bramblewick Cottage. Inside, the hearth popped once, decisively, as if announcing that winter had officially arrived, and the old clock above the mantel clicked into the long, slow stretch of Christmas Eve. That was when Juniper decided to steal the ribbon. Juniper, for the record, was not an ordinary cat. She was the color of toasted cream, with a plume of a tail that curved like a question mark and eyes sharp enough to notice everything, especially things she wasn't supposed to touch. She had been napping in the sewing basket for nearly an hour, pretending to be a harmless bundle of fur while her human, Aloan, wrapped presents at the kitchen table. Juniper had been planning the theft meticulously. The ribbon lay coiled beside a parcel wrapped in brown paper and stamped with a sprig of holly. It was red, silky, and most importantly, new. New ribbons were irresistible. They smelled faintly of starch and shop shelves and promise. Juniper waited until Aloan leaned back in her chair, sighing softly as she admired her work, before extending one delicate paw. Hook-tug gone. The ribbon slid across the table like a fleeing snake and disappeared beneath the settle by the fire. Aloan won't notice, Juniper thought, already congratulating herself. She was wrong, of course, but that was a problem for later. Bramblewick Cottage sat at the very edge of the village, where the cobbled road surrendered to hedgerows and the woods pressed close, curious and ancient. The cottage had been built crookedly, as though it had grown that way, and inside it smelled perpetually of baked apples, beeswax, and old books. Aloan had lived there for 3 winters now, ever since she decided she wanted a quieter life, one with fewer clocks and more birds. Juniper had arrived on the second night, soaking wet and furious about it. She had appeared on the windowsill during a storm, yowling like a creature personally betrayed by the universe. Aloan, startled but soft-hearted, had opened the window, wrapped the cat in a tea towel, and murmured nonsense apologies as if the rain had been her fault. Juniper had accepted the hospitality grudgingly, then never left. Tonight the cottage glowed. Candles flickered in jars along the shelves. Dried oranges and cinnamon sticks hung from twine across the beams. The kettle hummed companionably, and outside the snow thickened, turning the world into a quieter, gentler version of itself. Juniper emerged from beneath the settle, dragging the ribbon triumphantly. She paused, ears swiveling, as Aloan began to hum, a low, tuneless melody she only ever sang when she was content and a little tired. The cat's whiskers twitched. Aloan was in a good mood. That made mischief especially satisfying. Juniper trotted down the hallway, ribbon trailing behind her like a victory banner. She slipped into the bedroom, leapt onto the bed, and proceeded to wrestle the ribbon with great enthusiasm. She kicked it with her back paws, rolled onto her spine and bit it ferociously, growling as if it were a sworn enemy. When the ribbon finally lay limp and wrinkled, Juniper sat up, chest puffed out. Another successful campaign. From the window she could see the village below, chimneys breathing smoke, lanterns glowing like fireflies, the faint movement of someone hurrying home with a basket tucked under their arm. Church bells would ring later, she knew. They always did. Juniper liked the bells. They vibrated pleasantly in her bones. A knock sounded at the door. Juniper froze. Knocks were interesting. Knocks meant people, and people often meant dropped crumbs, unfamiliar boots, and the possibility of admiration. She leapt from the bed and raced down the hall, skidding slightly on the rug. Aloan opened the door to reveal Mrs. Hawthorne from next door, bundled in scarves and smelling of snow and cloves. "I brought the mince pies," Mrs. Hawthorne said, smiling in the way of someone who had lived long enough to be kind on purpose. "Oh, you're an angel," Eloan replied. "Come in before you freeze." Juniper wove between their ankles, purring loudly, already angling for attention. Mrs. Hawthorne bent down immediately, as everyone sensible did, and scratched Juniper behind the ears. "Well, if it isn't the true mistress of the house," she said. Juniper accepted the compliment as her due. The pies were set on the table. Tea was poured. The two women chatted about the snow, the carolers expected later, the way winter seemed to settle deeper into the bones each year. Juniper hopped onto the windowsill and watched the snow fall harder, the world narrowing into white and warmth. It was then that she noticed something amiss. The stocking. 3 stockings hung by the fire, one knitted in green wool, one in red, and one much smaller, decorated with tiny embroidered mice. Juniper's stocking. She had supervised its creation personally, batting at the yarn and stealing needles whenever possible. It was sagging. Juniper's eyes narrowed. Stockings were meant to be filled, yes, but not yet, not before the important hours of the night. A sagging stocking suggested premature activity, unauthorized activity. She padded closer, sniffed the air. Pine, chocolate, orange peel, and something else fishy, distinctly fishy. Someone had already put something in her stocking. This would not do. Juniper rose onto her hind legs and peered inside. There, nestled among tissue paper, was a small parcel tied with twine. It was wrapped carefully, lovingly, and it was definitely for her. Juniper's tail lashed. Rules mattered, even to cats, especially to cats. She glanced at Eloan and Mrs. Hawthorne, deep in conversation, then back at the stocking. The temptation warred with principle. Her clever mind began to work. If she removed the parcel now, no one would know. She could stash it somewhere safe, examine it properly, and replace it later. Yes, that was the solution. She reached in with one paw and tugged gently. The stocking, unbalanced, swayed. Juniper tugged again. The stocking slipped from the mantel entirely, spilling its contents onto the hearth with a soft thud. Silence fell. Eloan turned slowly. Juniper sat very still, paw still resting on the parcel, ears angled back just enough to suggest innocence. "Oh, Juniper," Eloan said, trying not to laugh. "You couldn't wait, could you?" Juniper blinked, the picture of dignity, as if stockings had been falling from mantels entirely on their own since the dawn of time. Mrs. Hawthorne chuckled. "Smart cat," she said, "knows when something's hers." Juniper allowed herself a small purr. Smart indeed. Later, when the pies were gone and Mrs. Hawthorne had trudged home through the snow, Eloan tidied the kitchen and banked the fire. The house grew quieter, heavier with night. Juniper followed her from room to room, the ribbon forgotten, her earlier mischief settling into a pleasant drowsiness. Eloan picked up a book and curled into the armchair. Juniper leapt onto her lap, kneading the blanket until it was just right. Outside, the snow kept falling. And somewhere beyond the hedgerows and the dark trees, something old and gentle stirred, something that had been watching Bramblewick Cottage for a very long time, waiting for the exact right moment to draw a little closer. As Juniper's ears flicked toward a sound that didn't belong to wind or bell or footstep, and her clever mind began to wonder what kind of Christmas this was going to be. Juniper did not move. That alone was unusual enough to matter. She lay heavy and warm on Eloan's lap, her purr a steady undercurrent beneath the soft crackle of the fire, but every muscle beneath her fur had gone alert. Her ears rotated slowly, independently, triangulating the sound again. There, A hush within the hush. Not silence exactly, more like something pausing to listen back. Elowen, absorbed in her book, turned a page. The paper whispered. Juniper flicked the very tip of her tail in irritation. Humans were wonderfully attentive creatures, but only to the things they expected. The sound came again, a faint crunch. Not snow settling from a branch, not the wind combing the hedges. This was deliberate, careful. Footsteps. Juniper slipped from Elowen's lap and landed without a sound on the braided rug. Elowen glanced down, smiling. "Changed your mind," she murmured, already drifting back to the page. Juniper did not dignify this with a response. She padded to the front window and leapt onto the bench beneath it, peering through the glass. The snow blurred everything into soft shapes and silver shadows, but Juniper's eyes were made for twilight and half-truths. She saw a figure standing just beyond the gate. It was tall, but not menacingly so, wrapped in layers of wool and something older, something that didn't quite read as fabric. The lantern it carried glowed not yellow, but a muted, pearly white, like moonlight caught in a jar. Snow fell around the figure and yet never seemed to touch it. Juniper's whiskers fanned forward. This was not a stranger in the ordinary sense. This was something that knew where it was going. The gate creaked open. Juniper let out a single sharp chirp. Elowen looked up at once. "What is it?" she asked, following Juniper's gaze to the window. "Do you see something, clever girl?" Juniper sat and wrapped her tail neatly around her paws. She did not chirp again. If Elowen saw the figure, she might worry, and worrying was exhausting. Better to assess the situation first. The figure moved closer to the cottage, boots making no sound at all. The lantern swung gently, illuminating the wreath on the door, the snow-dusted herbs hanging to dry, the small carved star Juniper herself had knocked off the windowsill last winter and never been forgiven for. The knock came softly. 3 taps, polite, almost apologetic. Elowen hesitated, book forgotten. "That's odd," she said aloud. "So late." Juniper trotted to the door and sat beside it, posture impeccable. Whatever this was, it had chosen to come here tonight on Christmas Eve. That alone made it significant. Elowen opened the door. Cold air spilled in, carrying with it the scent of pine resin, distant frost, and something like old stories. The figure inclined its head. "Good evening," it said, voice low and steady like snow settling on stone. "Forgive the hour." Elowen blinked, surprised but not afraid. She had always been that way, open, curious, trusting her instincts more than her fears. "Good evening," she replied. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," said the figure. "I am a courier." Juniper snorted quietly. Courier indeed. The figure glanced down, eyes catching the light. For a brief moment, Juniper felt the unmistakable sensation of being seen. Not as a cat, not as a pet, but as a thinking creature with opinions and responsibilities. She approved. "I was told there would be a cat," the figure added. Elowen laughed softly. "Oh yes, that would be Juniper." Juniper flicked an ear in acknowledgement. "I have something for her," said the figure, reaching into the folds of its cloak. Juniper's stalking incident flashed through her mind. Unauthorized gifts were becoming a pattern, and she did not care for it. The figure withdrew a small object, a bell no larger than a walnut, fashioned from silver that gleamed even in the low light. Etched along its surface were symbols Juniper did not recognize, but she understood them all the same. Paths, doors, names spoken once and remembered forever. The bell did not ring. "May I?" the figure asked. Elowen hesitated only a moment before nodding. "If Juniper doesn't mind." Juniper rose and took one deliberate step forward. She sniffed the bell. It smelled of frost and faraway hearths, of mice that lived in stories instead of fields. Acceptable. The figure tied the bell gently to Juniper's collar. The knot was perfect. Of course it was. It will only sound when needed, the figure said, and only she will know when that is. Eloan opened her mouth to ask a dozen questions, but the figure straightened, already retreating. Thank you for your hospitality, it said. You have a good home, keep the fire lit. With that, it stepped backward into the snow, the lantern dimming, the shape dissolving into the white as if it had never been. The gate clicked shut. Eloan stood for a long moment, staring at the empty path. Then she exhaled a small, incredulous laugh. Well, she said, that was something. Juniper shook her head once. The bell did not ring. Later, when the door was locked and the candles extinguished one by one, Eloan climbed the stairs to bed. Juniper followed, thoughtful now. The house settled around them, beams creaking, snow whispering against the windows. Juniper curled at the foot of the bed, eyes half-lidded, but her mind stayed alert. Because now she could hear things she hadn't before. Not sounds exactly, more like intentions brushing past the edges of the night. The woods shifting, the village breathing, old paths aligning themselves carefully, like chess pieces being nudged into place. The bell remained silent. Juniper flexed her paws, claws sheathing and unsheathing against the quilt. Whatever was coming had not arrived yet. But it would. And when it did, Juniper intended to be ready. Juniper dreamed of doors. Not the ordinary sort, the sensible wooden kind with hinges and drafts and the faint scent of varnish, but doors that appeared where they had no right to be. Doors stitched into hedges, doors floating upright in snowfall, doors that opened inward even when there was nowhere for inward to be. She knew instinctively which ones were meant for her. The bell at her collar chimed once in her sleep. Juniper's eyes flew open. The sound was impossibly soft, like a snowflake landing on silk, but it vibrated straight through her bones. The room was dark, washed in moonlight, Eloan breathing slow and even beneath the quilt. The house was still, too still, as though it were holding its breath. Juniper lifted her head. The bell did not ring again. It never would without reason. She slid from the bed and padded across the floor, careful to avoid the loose board by the door that always betrayed her. The moon followed her, silvering her whiskers, catching in the little bell so that it gleamed but remained silent. Downstairs, the hearth had gone to embers. Shadows stretched long and strange, and the familiar shapes of furniture looked briefly unfamiliar, as if they were considering rearranging themselves when no one was watching. Juniper paused at the bottom of the stairs. Something was wrong. Not dangerous, not yet, but off balance. Like a picture hung a fraction of an inch crooked, Juniper's tail fluffed slightly despite her efforts to appear composed. Then she heard it. A sound from inside the walls. Not scurrying, not settling. This was a slow, deliberate shifting as though the cottage itself were remembering an old habit. Juniper placed a paw against the plaster. It was cool and faintly humming. The bell chimed again. This time, Juniper understood. She trotted to the front door, hopped onto the little bench and peered out the window. The snow had stopped. The world lay under a smooth, unbroken blanket of white, glowing faintly under the moon. Except for the footprints. They began at the gate and led not to the door, but past it, curving around the side of the cottage toward the garden. The prints were shallow, as though whoever made them weighed very little or knew precisely how not to press down. Juniper's pupils widened. The garden was asleep for winter. Beds lay tucked under straw, the apple tree stood bare and patient, and the old stone well sat at the far edge, capped and forgotten. Forgotten by humans, anyway. Juniper leapt down and padded to the back door. It was latched, of course, but the cat flap beneath it yawned open, a small, humble portal that Juniper had never thought twice about before. The bell chimed, sharper now. Juniper slipped through. The cold bit immediately, sharp and bracing. Snow crunched under her paws, but the sound seemed muffled, as if the night itself were being courteous. She followed the footprints, nose low, every sense alert. The garden felt different, larger. The shadows between the beds seemed deeper than they should be, stretching in ways that did not match the moon's angle. Juniper stopped, reassessed, then continued on, refusing to be intimidated by a poorly behaved perspective. The footprints ended at the well. Juniper circled it once, twice. The stones were rimed with frost, etched with old marks that most creatures no longer noticed. Juniper noticed. She always had. Cats remembered things the world preferred to forget. She peered down into the dark. The bell rang. Clear, bright, unmistakable. Juniper sat back on her haunches. Well, she thought, so that's how it is. From the well rose a scent of damp stone, cold water, and something else, warm, almost sweet, like bread baking somewhere far underground. A whisper drifted up, not quite a voice, more like a thought brushing against her mind. Keeper. Juniper's ears flattened. She did not care for titles. They came with expectations. Still, she leaned closer. What has been misplaced, the whisper continued, must be retrieved before dawn. Juniper considered this. She considered Aloan asleep upstairs, trusting the house to remain itself. She considered the bell at her collar, heavy now with meaning. She considered the fact that Christmas morning was only hours away, and she had been promised fish. What's been misplaced? Juniper thought pointedly. The well shuddered. Images bloomed in Juniper's mind. The village square, the old oak at its center, lanterns hung for tomorrow's celebration. Beneath the roots of that oak, something small and bright pulsed faintly, like a star struggling to remember how to shine. The hearth spark, the whisper said, the first warmth of winter. Without it, the cold will not remain gentle. Juniper's tail lashed once. Of course it was something like that. It was never a lost mitten or a misplaced spoon. It was always the thing that held everything else together. And why me? Juniper thought. The answer came simply. Because you noticed. Juniper sighed, a long-suffering sound that nevertheless carried a note of pride. She stood, shook the snow from her paws, and glanced back toward the warm, lit windows of Bramblewick Cottage. Aloan stirred in her sleep, turned over and murmured Juniper's name. Juniper hesitated only a moment. Then she sat upright, rang the bell once, intentionally this time, and the garden shifted. The well deepened. The shadows leaned in. Somewhere a door that had not been there before began, very slowly, to open. The door did not creak. That was the first thing Juniper noticed. Any sensible door, especially one that had no business existing, ought to complain a little when it opened. It should groan or sigh, or at least whisper its objections to the cold. This door did none of that. It unfolded itself from the darkness beside the well as quietly as a thought being finished. It was tall and narrow, framed in wood that looked older than trees and smoother than stone. Frost traced its edges in delicate patterns, and at its center was a handle shaped like a curled fern. Juniper approached with care. The bell at her collar was warm now, faintly humming, as though pleased to be useful at last. Juniper reached out and tapped the handle with one paw. The door swung inward. On the other side was not the well. It was a path. A narrow one, paved with uneven stones dusted in snow, winding forward through a place that felt underground without being enclosed. The sky above was a deep, velvety indigo scattered with unfamiliar stars. Roots arched overhead like cathedral beams, glowing faintly from within, their light soft and steady, like embers that had decided not to fade. Juniper stepped through. The door closed behind her with a gentle finality. The air here smelled of earth and old rain, and stories told so often they had worn smooth. Juniper padded forward, her paws finding the stones instinctively. She had the uncanny sensation of walking somewhere she had never been, and yet had always known. The path curved. As she followed it, the world around her began to stir. Little movements at the edge of her vision, a twitch, a blink, a pause. Juniper stopped and sat, tail curled neatly around her feet. "Show yourselves," she thought. One by one they did. Mice emerged first, but not the sort Juniper chased in the barn. These were upright, wrapped in scraps of wool and leaf cloth, their eyes bright and thoughtful. They carried tiny lanterns made from acorn caps. They froze when they noticed her. Juniper raised an eyebrow. The mice bowed. "Keeper," one squeaked, voice trembling but respectful. "You've come." Juniper resisted the urge to preen. "Yes," she thought, "I have." The mice relaxed slightly, lanterns bobbing. One scurried closer, craning its neck to peer at the bell. It rang, didn't it? Juniper flicked her tail once. A murmur rippled through the group. "She heard it," whispered another. "She always does." Juniper cleared her throat internally. "Where is it?" The mice glanced at one another. Then, silently, they parted, revealing the path continuing onward, downward now, toward a soft orange glow in the distance. "The oak," said the first mouse, "but it's not right, something blocking it." Juniper frowned. Blocking warmth was unforgivable. She resumed walking, the mice falling into step behind her in a loose, respectful procession. The path sloped gently downward, and the air grew warmer with each step. Juniper could feel it along her whiskers, a comforting heat that reminded her of afternoons by the hearth. They emerged into a wide hollow beneath the village. Above them rose the roots of the great oak, vast and twisting, their bark etched with old runes and natural whorls that marked the passing of centuries. At the center of the hollow, cradled in a nest of roots, glowed the hearth spark. It was beautiful. A small, steady flame no bigger than a kitten's paw, hovering just above the ground. It burned without smoke or sound, its light soft and golden, radiating a warmth that sank into Juniper's bones. But it was dimmer than it should have been. And wrapped around the roots nearby was something that did not belong. It looked like frost, but wrong, thicker, grayer. It clung to the bark like lichen, spreading slowly, dampening the glow of the hearth spark. Where it touched, the warmth faltered. Juniper's fur bristled. "What is that?" she thought. The mice huddled closer together. "A cold creep," one whispered. "It comes when winters forget their manners." Juniper narrowed her eyes. Winter's forgetting manners was something she took personally. She padded closer to the hearth spark, careful not to step on any mice. The bell chimed softly, sympathetically. Juniper reached out a paw and held it near the flame. It did not burn her. Instead, it pulsed gently, as if recognizing her. "You're not lost," Juniper thought. "You're just stuck." The cold creep twitched. A sound echoed through the hollow, low, creaking like ice shifting on a lake. Juniper turned slowly. From the shadows between the roots, something began to move. It was tall and thin, formed of frost and fog and forgotten winters. Its eyes were pale blue hollows, and its limbs bent at odd angles, as though it had been assembled hastily from spare cold. "I wondered when you'd come," it said, voice like snow crunching underfoot. Juniper sat down and wrapped her tail neatly around her paws. "I wondered who had the nerve," she thought back. The thing smiled, and the temperature dropped. "I'm only taking what was left unattended," it replied. "Warmth grows careless, cold is patient." Juniper glanced at the hearthspark, then at the oak roots, then back at the creature. "You're making a mess," she thought flatly. The mice gasped. The cold creep laughed, a sound like icicles clinking together. "And what will you do, little keeper? Scratch me." Juniper's eyes gleamed. As she stood, the bell rang, clear, bright, and commanding. The roots overhead responded, light flaring through their veins. The hearthspark pulsed stronger, its glow pushing back the shadows inch by inch. Juniper arched her back, every hair on her body standing on end. "I'll remind Winter," she thought calmly, "how this story goes." And with that she took her first deliberate step toward the cold, knowing, deep in her clever, mischievous heart, that this was only the beginning. The cold creep recoiled, not far, not yet, but enough to notice. Juniper noticed everything. She advanced another step, paused silent on the stone, the bell at her collar ringing not loudly now but steadily, like a heartbeat remembering itself. With each chime, the hollow brightened. The oak roots glowed warmer, their ancient lines sharpening as though the tree were waking from a deep and necessary sleep. The mice squeaked and scattered to the edges of the hollow, lanterns bobbing wildly. One brave little mouse stayed close, clutching its acorn light with both paws, eyes fixed on Juniper with awe that bordered on terror. The cold creep drew itself taller. "You cannot command Winter," it said, frost cracking along its limbs. "I am what remains when fires die and songs are forgotten." Juniper paused and sat down. The mice gasped again. The cold creep blinked, clearly thrown off. Juniper began to groom one paw with exaggerated calm. "You misunderstand," she thought, not bothering to look at it. "I'm not commanding anything." She lifted her head slowly and met the creature's hollow gaze. "I'm correcting you." The bell chimed once, sharp, precise. The hearthspark flared. Warmth surged through the hollow, not as a blast but as a certainty. The cold creep hissed, frost peeling away from the roots it had clung to, retreating like a tide pulled back by the moon. "You were left alone too long," Juniper continued coolly. "That happens, but you don't get to take what isn't yours just because no one was watching." The creature staggered, its edges blurring. "They forgot," it insisted. "They always forget. Fires go out, doors close, names fade." Juniper's tail flicked. "Yes," she thought, "and then they light them again." She took another step forward, placing herself directly between the hearthspark and the cold creep. The warmth curled around her like a shawl, threading through her fur, humming in her bones. For a fleeting moment, Juniper understood something vast and old, that she was not merely guarding warmth but memory, continuity, the quiet insistence that things worth keeping were worth tending. The cold creep let out a long, cracking sigh. "You are not meant to be here," it said more softly now. Juniper tilted her head. "Oh," she thought, "I very much am." The bell rang a third time. "Not just here. Everywhere." Far above, in the village square, lanterns flickered brighter. In Bramblewick Cottage, the embers in the hearth stirred, glowing faintly under their ash. Aloan turned in her sleep, smiling without knowing why. The oak's roots shifted. Slowly, deliberately, they began to move, not violently, not angrily, but with the patient authority of something that had always known where it belonged. The roots tightened, encircling the hearth spark protectively, sealing off the places where cold had crept in. The cold creep stumbled backward, its form thinning, unraveling into mist. "This isn't over," it whispered, voice already fatting. "Winter is long." Juniper sat again, tail curled neatly around her paws. "So am I," she thought. The creature dissolved, seeping away into cracks and shadows, retreating to places where it could do no harm, for now. The temperature in the hollow steadied, settling into a comfortable, living cold, the kind that made fires welcome instead of frightening. The mice crept back, eyes shining. "You did it," breathed the brave one. Juniper sniffed, obviously. The hearth spark glowed bright and true once more, its light steady and patient. Juniper approached and extended one paw, touching the warmth gently. It pulsed in response, then did something unexpected. A spark leapt. It did not burn. It landed on Juniper's paw like a kiss, then sank into her fur, leaving behind a faint golden mark that slowly faded, but not entirely. Juniper stared at it. She flexed her paw, the warmth remained. The mice murmured excitedly. "It's marked you," one said. "That means—" "Yes, yes," Juniper thought quickly. Very honored, no need to make a fuss. But inwardly she felt the weight of it settle. Not heavy, exactly, but significant, like a responsibility tucked neatly behind the heart. The bell chimed softly once more, but this time it sounded satisfied. The hollow began to change. The roots eased back into stillness. The unfamiliar stars dimmed, and the path behind Juniper shimmered faintly, the door beginning to reassert itself in the corner of her vision. The mice bowed deeply. "Will you come again?" one asked. Juniper considered this. "I suppose I might," she thought, "if things misbehave." With that, she turned and padded back along the stone path, the warmth at her paw a gentle reminder with every step. The door awaited her, already opening, already remembering its shape. As Juniper crossed the threshold, the underground world folded itself away like a well-kept secret. She emerged into the garden, snow crunching beneath her paws once more. The well stood silent and ordinary again, the night calm, the sky pale with the promise of morning. Juniper paused and looked back. For just a moment, she thought she saw the oak's roots glowing faintly beneath the earth. Then it was gone. She slipped back through the cat flap and into the warmth of Bramblewick Cottage. Inside, the house hummed contentedly, as though it too had been corrected. Juniper padded upstairs, leapt lightly onto the bed and curled against Eloan's feet. The bell at her collar was still. The mark on her paw faded further, though not completely. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, polite, exactly as it should be. Juniper closed her eyes. There would be questions later, consequences, perhaps more doors. But for now, Christmas morning was approaching, and Juniper intended to be well rested when it arrived. Juniper slept, but not deeply. That too was unusual. She dozed in the pleasant, drifting way of a cat who trusted her surroundings, yet her awareness hovered just beneath the surface, like a paw resting lightly on water. The warmth from the hearth spark lingered in her bones, a gentle echo, and the bell at her collar felt. Heavier now, not uncomfortable, just present, as if it were reminding her that the night had not been a dream. Eloan stirred as dawn crept closer, the sky beyond the curtains paling from ink to pearl. The house shifted and sighed, wood adjusting to the cold, the kettle downstairs ticking faintly as it cooled. Somewhere far away, a church bell tolled the hour, muffled by snow. Juniper's eyes opened. The bell at her collar did not ring, but it thrummed softly, a private sensation that made her whiskers twitch. She stretched one paw, and noted with quiet satisfaction that the faint warmth was still there. Subtle, easily overlooked, but real. Good. Elowen rolled onto her side and smiled sleepily when she felt Juniper move. "Morning already," she murmured. "Merry Christmas, you little menace." Juniper purred deep and steady and pressed her forehead briefly against Elowen's ankle. Menace indeed, if only she knew. The smell of morning soon followed. Kindling catching in the hearth, bread warming in the oven, citrus peel curling into fragrant spirals. Juniper followed Elowen downstairs, tail high, surveying the house as if seeing it for the first time. Everything was as it should be. The stockings hung by the fire once more, rebalanced and properly fluffed. Juniper's had been returned to its rightful place, its contents restored, plus, she noticed with interest, a little extra something tucked in near the toe. She filed that observation away for later. Outside, the village began to wake. Doors opened. Laughter drifted faintly on the cold air. Somewhere a child shrieked with delight, and Juniper winced but forgave them. It was Christmas. Elowen carried her mug of tea to the window and stood there for a moment, gazing out at the snow. "It feels warmer today," she said thoughtfully. "Don't you think?" Juniper jumped onto the windowsill beside her and blinked innocently. Warmth was a relative thing. As the morning wore on, visitors came and went. Mrs. Hawthorne returned with a wrapped loaf and a kiss on Elowen's cheek. The baker stopped by with leftover buns. Someone left a wreath at the gate without knocking. Juniper accepted admiration graciously, allowing herself to be stroked exactly twice by each person before slipping out of reach. She watched them all carefully. Not because she suspected trouble, but because she could. Because now, when people stepped inside the cottage, Juniper felt faint impressions cling to them like snowflakes on wool. Intentions, worries, quiet joys, most passed harmlessly, melting away in the warmth of the house. One did not. Just after midday, when the sun hung low and pale and Elowen was busy slicing apples for a tart, Juniper felt it, a thin thread of cold brushing past the threshold. Her ears pricked. The bell did not ring, which meant this was not a crisis. Yet, Juniper padded to the door and sat, tail curled neatly. Outside, a man stood hesitantly at the gate, hat in his hands, breath puffing white. He looked ordinary enough, reddened nose, patched coat, but his shadow stretched oddly long behind him, pooling in places it shouldn't. Juniper narrowed her eyes. Elowen noticed him a moment later. "Oh, hello," she called, opening the door just a crack. "Can I help you?" "I hope so," the man said, voice weary rather than threatening. "I was told there might be warmth here." Juniper's tail flicked once. The man's gaze dropped to her, and for the briefest instant his expression shifted. Relief, sharp and sudden, like someone spotting a landmark after being lost too long. "Ah," he said quietly, "you've got one." Juniper did not blink. Elowen glanced between them, puzzled. "One cat," she offered. The man smiled faintly. "Yes," he said, "that's what I meant." Juniper rose and walked forward, stopping just inside the threshold. She met the man's eyes and held his gaze. There was cold clinging to him, yes, but not the greedy kind. This cold was tired, worn thin. It had followed him a long way without being invited. Juniper made a decision. She sat. The bell remained silent. Aloan, taking this as a good sign, as she always did, opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "At least warm yourself." The man stepped inside, and the cold loosened its grip almost immediately, slewing off like a coat set aside. The hearth crackled brighter. The house hummed its quiet approval. Juniper watched it all from beneath the table, eyes half-lidded, mind alert. This was new. Not a creature to chase away, not a thing to correct. Something unfinished. As the man warmed his hands and spoke softly of roads and storms and missed turns, Juniper listened. She listened not just with ears, but with the strange new sense settling into her, a sense of when warmth needed guarding and when it needed sharing. Outside, the snow began to fall again. Not hurried, not heavy. Just enough. The man stayed longer than Juniper expected. He drank 2 cups of tea, holding the mug as if afraid it might vanish if he loosened his grip. He spoke in fragments, about a road that had seemed shorter on the map, about a night that had stretched strangely, about the way the cold had felt intentional out there, as though it were waiting for him to make a mistake. Aloan listened the way she always did, with her whole body angled toward the speaker, with pauses that invited more words rather than filling the silence. Juniper approved of this habit. Silence was often where the important things hid. Juniper circled the man once, then twice. He smelled of wool and frost and something else, something faintly familiar. Old leaves, root cellars, the underside of the oak's shadow. Live. So that was it. Juniper stopped in front of him and sat, gaze steady. The man met her eyes again, and this time he did not look away. "You keep it well," he said quietly, not to Aloan. Juniper's tail wrapped around her paws. "Yes," she thought, "I do." The bell gave the softest possible hum. Not a ring, not a warning, but an acknowledgement. The man exhaled, shoulders easing as if a weight had finally been set down. "I wondered," he murmured. "It's been so long since anyone noticed." Aloan smiled, oblivious to the deeper current. "Juniper notices everything," she said fondly. "Don't you?" Juniper blinked slowly. Eventually, the man rose to leave. He thanked Aloan with a sincerity that lingered in the room after the door closed behind him. Outside, his footprints led back toward the village road, and then, quite suddenly, they didn't. They simply ended, as though he had stepped off the path into something that no longer required tracks. Juniper watched from the window until the snow smoothed everything over. When she turned back, the house felt subtly fuller, warmer in a way that had nothing to do with fire or insulation. The hearth spark's echo stirred faintly within her, satisfied. Aloan set the apple tart on the table. "Well," she said, brushing flour from her hands, "that was interesting." Juniper hopped onto a chair and peered at the tart with keen interest. Duties aside, there were still standards to maintain. The afternoon drifted by in that soft, suspended way unique to holidays, time neither rushing nor standing still but meandering pleasantly, stopping now and then to admire something small. Aloan read. Juniper napped. The bell remained quiet. Until it didn't. The first ring came just as the light outside began to thin. Juniper's eyes snapped open. This ring was different from the others. Not urgent, not sharp. It resonated outward rather than inward, like a ripple moving away from a stone instead of toward it. Juniper lifted her head. The house answered. Not audibly but structurally, the beams settling, the walls remembering their corners, the doorframes holding firm. Bramblewick Cottage was not just shelter, it was a place, and places, Juniper was learning, could be called upon. She rose and padded toward the hearth. Eloin noticed at once. "What is it now?" she asked gently, though there was a flicker of unease beneath the affection. Juniper sat by the fire and looked directly into the embers. The bell rang again. In the flames something shifted, not an image exactly, but a sense of distance collapsing, of elsewhere pressing closer. Juniper saw, layered over the familiar stones and iron grate, a glimpse of the village square. The oak. Its branches swayed though there was no wind. Lanterns flickered, some dimmer than they should have been. People moved below, laughing, carrying baskets, unaware that something subtle was tugging at the edges of their warmth. Juniper's ears flattened. This was not an attack. It was a drift. Left unattended, it would not destroy anything outright. It would simply cool things, gradually, quietly, until joy took a little more effort each year, until gatherings ended earlier, until fewer songs were remembered. Juniper stood. Eloin watched her, frowning now. "Juniper." Juniper turned and met her gaze. For a moment, just a moment, Eloin saw something in her cat's eyes that made her breath catch. Not fear, not alarm. Resolve. Juniper walked to the door and looked back once. The bell chimed, low and steady. Eloin swallowed. "All right," she said slowly, surprising herself. "Just don't be long." Juniper slipped outside. The village was transformed by twilight. Snow reflected lamplight, turning every path into a ribbon of gold. Voices drifted from houses, music from somewhere near the square. It should have felt joyous. Juniper felt the thin places. She moved quickly now, body low, purposeful. She passed hedges that leaned a little too far inward, corners where shadows lingered longer than they should. Each time, the bell hummed and the shadows retreated, chastened. By the time Juniper reached the square, the lanterns around the oak were guttering. The oak itself stood tall, but tired. Its roots pulsed faintly beneath the frozen ground, the hearth sparks glow steady but strained. Juniper leapt onto the low stone wall surrounding the tree. Enough, she thought, not angrily but firmly. The bell rang. From the crowd, a few people paused, frowning slightly, as though they had forgotten what they were about to say. A child looked up at the tree and smiled for no reason she could name. Juniper felt something stir beneath the earth. The oak responded. Its roots shifted just enough to remind the ground of their presence. Warmth spread outward, not heat but welcome. Lantern flames steadied. Laughter resumed, a shade brighter than before. Juniper exhaled. But even as balance returned, she sensed it again, that patient watching cold. Not here, not now. Waiting. Juniper sat beneath the oak, tail curled around her paws, eyes scanning the square. Christmas was not over yet. And neither, she suspected, was her work. Juniper remained beneath the oak, long after the lanterns had steadied. She sat very still, a pale shape against the dark stone, watching the village the way a riverbank watches water, allowing it to move, but never losing awareness of its currents. People passed close by without noticing her, though a few slowed instinctively, smiles tugging at their mouths for reasons they could not name. One woman bent to adjust a crooked ribbon on a wreath. A man laughed louder than he had meant to. Somewhere, a fiddle found the right key on its second try instead of its third. Small corrections. They mattered. The oak's roots pulsed once more beneath the earth, then settled into a patient, contented quiet. Juniper felt the response through her marked paw, a gentle warmth like a shared understanding. She lifted it, examined it in the lantern light. The golden trace was nearly gone now, visible only if you knew to look. Good, she thought, Mark should never shout. The bell at her collar did not ring again. Its work here was done. Juniper rose and padded through the square, weaving between boots and hems with practiced ease. Snow brushed her whiskers. Laughter drifted above her head. She slipped past the bakery, where heat and sugar perfumed the air, past the little bookshop with its window glowing like a promise, past the church steps where candles flickered in glass jars. At the edge of the square she paused. The road beyond stretched pale and quiet, untouched since the morning. It led out past the hedgerows, toward fields and woods and the places where things waited. Juniper studied it carefully, weighing possibilities. Not tonight. She turned back toward Bramblewick Cottage. The walk home felt shorter than it should have, as though the village itself were gently nudging her along. By the time she slipped through the cat flap, the sky had deepened to a soft, star-pricked blue. Inside, the house wrapped around her at once, warm, familiar, solid. Eloin sat by the hearth, a blanket around her shoulders, a half-finished mug of cider cooling on the table. She looked up the moment Juniper entered. "There you are," she said, relief plain in her voice. "I was beginning to worry." Juniper jumped onto the rug and shook snow from her fur with efficient precision. Eloin laughed softly. "You always look like you meant to do exactly whatever it is you've just done." Juniper accepted this assessment. She leapt onto the arm of the chair and head-butted Eloin's shoulder gently, just once. Eloin smiled and reached up to scratch behind her ears, fingers warm, familiar, grounding. Outside, the wind shifted. The sound of it against the windows changed, subtle, but Juniper heard it immediately. Not stronger, not colder. Curious. The bell hummed. Juniper's ears flicked. She sat up straighter, gaze turning toward the front of the house. Eloin followed her look, though she could see nothing unusual. "What is it now?" Eloin murmured without fear. Juniper did not answer. She hopped down and padded toward the door, then stopped, considering. The bell's hum faded again, leaving behind only a faint echo. A test, Juniper decided. She waited. Minutes passed, the fire settled. Eloin turned a page in her book, the house breathed. Then came the sound, barely audible, just at the edge of perception. A scratch. Not at the door, not at the window. At the walls. Juniper's fur lifted along her spine. This was not the old wood shifting. This was deliberate, exploratory. She moved toward the sound, tracing it along the baseboard, into the corner where the shadow always lingered deepest at night. The bell remained silent, which told her something important. Whatever this was, it was not yet a threat. But it was learning. Juniper sat and watched the shadow. Slowly, so slowly it might have been imagined, it deepened. Not spreading exactly, but concentrating like ink pooling in a crease. Within it, something shifted, uncertain of its own shape. Juniper did not blink. "You're early," she thought calmly. The shadow hesitated. Juniper flicked her tail. The shadow withdrew, thinning, retreating back into the wall as though embarrassed to have been noticed at all. The house creaked once decisively, as if clearing its throat. Eloin looked up. "Did you hear that?" Juniper turned and walked back to her, jumping lightly into her lap and curling there with practiced ease. Eloin wrapped the blanket more securely around them both. "Probably just the cold," she said, though she sounded unconvinced. Juniper purred, steady and reassuring. Outside, snow resumed its careful fall. Inside, the bell rested against Juniper's chest, quiet but awake. And far beyond the village, past the fields, past the woods, past even the places that remembered being places, something paused, recalculated, and began to adjust its plans. Juniper slept, but this time she dreamed not of doors, but of paths. Juniper walked the path alone. It unfurled beneath her paws as if it had been waiting, stone giving way to packed earth, earth to frost-silvered grass. The world around her was neither night nor day, but the soft in-between where meanings loosened and rearranged themselves. Above, there was no sky as such, only a high, pale openness streaked with the suggestion of clouds. This path did not ask where she was going. It already knew. Juniper moved with the confidence of a creature who had accepted that curiosity and responsibility were now permanently intertwined. Her bell did not ring, but it warmed with each step, a quiet companion rather than a guide. On either side of the path, things stirred. Not creatures exactly, more like impressions that had learned to stand upright. A patch of frost that remembered being a pond. A crooked fence post that had once marked a boundary no one enforced anymore. A forgotten promise, coiled and patient, humming faintly as Juniper passed. She acknowledged them all with a flick of her ears. Then the path forked. Juniper stopped. To the left, the way dipped downward, winding into mist. The air there smelled of old winters and long silences, of things that had been left behind because they were inconvenient to carry. To the right, the path climbed gently, curving toward a glow that reminded Juniper of hearthlight filtered through snow. Juniper sat and considered. This was new. Until now she had responded, corrected, guarded, but a fork suggested choice, and choice implied consequence beyond simple balance. The bell chimed once. Not a command. An invitation. Juniper stood and took the right-hand path. As she walked, the glow ahead resolved into something familiar. Windows. Not a single house, but many cottages and shops and barns, all layered together as though seen through overlapping memories. Lights glimmered behind the glass, warm and steady, and Juniper felt the unmistakable sensation of being expected. She emerged into a version of Bramblewick Village that was not quite the village itself. Here, every door was slightly ajar. Every hearth burned just a little brighter than necessary. Snow fell, but it never accumulated. It touched the ground and vanished, satisfied. Juniper padded through the streets, unnoticed but not unwelcomed. The air thrummed with something like gratitude. She passed a baker's oven that hummed even though no one tended it. She passed a well that whispered to itself, murmuring old jokes in a language of echoes. At the center of this almost village stood the oak. Not the oak. An oak taller, broader, its roots rising above ground like the ribs of the earth. Beneath it sat a circle of stones, and on those stones were gathered others. Juniper slowed. They were not cats, though some were cat-shaped. A fox with silvered eyes sat primly, tail wrapped around her feet. An owl perched low, wings tucked, gaze penetrating. A dog, old, scarred, gentle, lay with his head on his paws, watching Juniper approach with calm approval. Keepers. Juniper felt it immediately, the way one knows when one has stepped into the correct room. The fox inclined her head. You heard the bell. Juniper sat, obviously. The owl clicked its beak, amused, still sharp. The dog's tail thumped once against the stone. We wondered when you'd arrive, the fox continued. It's been a long time since the village chose one so local. Juniper bristled slightly. I didn't choose anything. The fox smiled. Neither did we, that's usually how it works. Juniper glanced around the circle. So what is this exactly? A pause, said the owl, before things lean too far. Juniper considered this. They're already leaning. Yes, the dog agreed gently. That's why we're here. The oak behind them creaked softly, roots flexing. Juniper felt the hearth sparks echo respond within her, resonating faintly with something deeper, older. The cold creep was only one symptom, the fox said. Small imbalances, minor forgettings, but there are other things waking. Juniper's tail flicked, like shadows that scratch at walls. The other stilled. You've noticed that already, the owl said. Juniper lifted her chin. I notice things. The fox's smile faded into something more serious. Then you've likely noticed the paths changing too. Juniper thought of the fork, the right hand glow, the left hand mist. Yes, she thought. That's the trouble, the dog said quietly. When paths multiply, some lead nowhere good, and some lead places no one remembers how to leave. Juniper looked up at the oak, at its vast roots, at the way warmth pulsed through the ground like a steady heartbeat. What do you want from me? She asked. The fox met her gaze, unblinking. For now, to keep doing what you're doing. Juniper frowned. That's vague. The owl ruffled its feathers. Welcome to stewardship. A breeze passed through the circle, carrying with it a distant sound. Laughter, maybe, or bells, or something breaking far away. The bell at Juniper's collar hummed. The fox stood. Time moving again, you should wake. Juniper hesitated. Will I see you again? The dog smiled. Paths cross when they need to. The village began to blur, edges softening like breath on glass. Juniper felt the familiar pull of warmth and weight, of fur and floorboards and a low and steady presence. As the dream dissolved, the owl's voice reached her one last time. Watch the quiet places, keeper. That's where things begin. Juniper opened her eyes. She lay once more in Bramblewick Cottage, curled against a low inside, the fire low but steady. Outside, the wind had stilled. Snow lay untouched. The bell was quiet. Juniper did not move for a long while. She simply listened, to the house, to the village, to the subtle shifting of paths she could not yet see but now knew were there. Eventually she yawned, stretched one paw and settled back down. There would be time. There always was, until suddenly there was. Juniper woke to the sound of wind moving through trees. Not the impatient, rattling kind that shoved at windows and demanded attention, but the thoughtful kind, the kind that wandered, paused, doubled back on itself as if reconsidering an old opinion. It slid along the eaves of Bramblewick Cottage and sighed softly at the corners, testing, learning. Juniper opened one eye. The bell was cool. That, she noted, was new. She lay still, listening deeper than sound into the spaces between things. Aloan slept on, cocooned in quilts, one hand flung carelessly toward the edge of the bed where Juniper usually curled. The house was steady, content, but beyond it. Juniper's tail tip twitched. Beyond it, the paths were restless. She slipped from the bed and padded to the window. Dawn had not yet committed itself. The sky hovered in that pale gray indecision that came before color. Snow lay smooth and untouched in the garden, the apple tree etched dark against the lightening sky. And there, near the hedgerow, something was wrong. Not visible exactly, not yet, but Juniper could feel it the way one feels a draft before it finds skin. A thinning, a place where the world had been folded too often, creased and weakened by passing. A path trying to become something else. Juniper chirred softly to herself. Well, she thought, that won't do. She padded downstairs, every step soundless, and nosed open the back door. Cold kissed her whiskers, polite but insistent. The bell at her collar remained silent, though Juniper felt its awareness stir faintly, like a watchful eye half opening. The garden greeted her as it always had, but with subtle differences only she would notice. The snow near the well glittered a little too brightly. The shadow beneath the apple tree leaned in a direction it hadn't yesterday. Juniper crossed the garden, stopping just short of the hedgerow. She sniffed carefully. Lime. There it was. A scent like old paper and frozen breath, like footsteps that had been erased too many times. Something had brushed past here in the night, not entered, not stayed, but measured. Juniper sat. She waited. Time moved differently when you were listening properly. The wind stilled. The faintest birdsong began, hesitant, testing the morning. The hedgerow rustled not from wind but from decision. The space between two thorn branches darkened. Juniper's ears flattened, not in fear but focus. From the thinning stepped a shape no bigger than a child, wrapped in a cloak the color of frost-bitten leaves. Its face was indistinct, as though it had never fully decided what it should look like. It carried no lantern, no bell, no warmth. It stopped when it saw Juniper. They regarded one another. "You're early," Juniper thought, echoing her words from before. The thing tilted its head. "You're not supposed to be here," it replied, not aloud but directly into the cold spaces between her thoughts. Juniper flicked an ear. "I live here." "That's not what I mean." Juniper stood back straight, tail arched in effortless authority. "Then you should choose your words more carefully." The bell warmed. The thing recoiled slightly, not stepping back but pulling inward as if shrinking its presence. "You wear a marker," it said, "but you smell like hearths and milk and sun-warmed floorboards." Juniper allowed herself a small internal smile. People underestimate floorboards. Silence stretched. "You shouldn't interfere," the thing said at last. "The paths are correcting themselves." Juniper took one step forward. Snow did not crunch beneath her paw. "No," she thought calmly, "they're fraying." The thing hesitated. "You don't belong to the old circles," it said. "You're too close to humans." Juniper's whiskers twitched. "That's the point." The bell chimed, not loud, not sharp, but present. The garden responded. The apple tree's shadow straightened. The snow's glitter softened into something more honest. The thing's outline wavered. "You'll make more work for yourself," it warned. "There will be more doors, more forks." Juniper sat down deliberately, as if settling in for a long conversation. "Good," she thought. "I was getting bored." The thing studied her for a long moment. Then it stepped backward, not retreating, but folding itself carefully back into the thinning, which closed like a breath held and released. The hedgerow returned to thorns and snow. Juniper exhaled. Behind her, the back door creaked softly. "Elowen." Juniper turned her head just enough to see her human standing in the doorway, wrapped in a shawl, hair still sleep-tangled. "I thought I heard you," Elowen said. She smiled, though her eyes were thoughtful. "It's cold out here." Juniper walked back across the garden and brushed against Elowen's ankles, grounding her, anchoring her to the ordinary world of mugs and mornings. Elowen bent and scooped Juniper up, tucking her against her chest. "Come on," she murmured. "Let's get warm." Juniper allowed it. From Elowen's arms she watched the hedgerow one last time. It was quiet now, well-behaved. For the moment. Inside, the kettle began to sing. The hearth caught quickly, flames eager and bright. The cottage settled into mourning, unaware of how close the edges had come to shifting. Juniper curled in her favorite chair, eyes half-lidded, the bell resting against her chest. Paths were multiplying. Doors were remembering how to open. And Juniper, keeper of warmth and floorboards and quiet corrections, closed her eyes. not to sleep but to listen. By afternoon, the village had settled into that gentle lull that comes after too much warmth and too many sweets. Snow still lay thick on the rooftops, but footprints crisscrossed the lanes now, evidence of visits paid, gifts exchanged, stories retold for the 100th time. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, no longer urgent, just companionable. Bramblewick Cottage glowed like a held breath. Juniper lay on the windowsill, chin resting on her paws, watching it all. She could feel the paths even when she wasn't looking for them now. They tugged faintly at the edges of her awareness like threads drawn through fabric, some taut, some slack, some newly spun and still a little sticky with intention. Most behaved themselves. A few required watching. She preferred watching. Aloan moved through the cottage with quiet efficiency, humming as she tidied away plates and folded napkins. Every so often she glanced at Juniper, as though checking she was still there, still solid, still ordinary. Juniper understood the impulse. It was reassuring to see something familiar remain familiar. The bell rested cool against her chest, not asleep, never asleep, but listening in its own way. Juniper lifted one paw and groomed it carefully, pausing when she reached the spot where warmth sometimes bloomed if she paid attention to it. Still there. Faint. Patient. A knock came at the door. Juniper's head lifted instantly. Not sharp, not alarming, a neighborly knock, and yet. The bell gave the smallest possible pulse. Juniper slid from the sill and padded toward the door, placing herself between it and the rest of the house before Aloan even reached for the latch. Aloan noticed, eyebrows lifting. "Well," she murmured, "you're taking your job seriously today." Juniper did not look back. Aloan opened the door. On the threshold stood a girl of about 10 winters, bundled in a too-large coat, snow clinging to her boots. Her cheeks were red with cold, but her eyes were bright and searching. She clutched something in both hands, holding it tight to her chest. "Oh, hello," Aloan said warmly. "Can I help you?" The girl nodded, then shook her head, then nodded again. "I was told, Mrs. Hawthorne said, that there was a cat." Juniper sat. The girl's gaze snapped to her, relief flooding her face so quickly it startled even Juniper. "There you are," the girl breathed. Juniper's tail flicked once. "What have you got there?" Aloan asked gently. The girl hesitated, then held out her hands. In them was a small object wrapped in cloth, a scrap of old wool, mended many times over. From within it came a faint, uneven glow. Juniper's pupils widened. "Lie." So that was how the paths were fraying. "It won't stay warm," the girl said, voice trembling. "No matter what I do, and when it gets cold my house feels wrong." Juniper stood and approached slowly, sniffing the bundle. The glow pulsed weakly in response, as if relieved to be acknowledged. This was not a hearthspark. But it was kin. Aloan knelt beside them. "You did the right thing coming here," she said, though she didn't quite know why she was so certain. Juniper sat directly in front of the girl and met her eyes. "You noticed," Juniper thought. "That's important." The bell hummed, not ringing but resonating, like a string plucked once and left to vibrate. The girl's shoulders relaxed, just a fraction. "It listens to you," she whispered, awed. Juniper did not deny it. Carefully she placed one paw on the cloth-wrapped glow. Warmth flowed, not forcefully, not completely, but enough to steady it. The glow brightened, becoming more even, less frantic. The girl gasped softly. "There," Aloan said, smiling. "See, sometimes things just need help remembering what they are." Juniper withdrew her paw and sat back. The warmth receded but did not vanish. Temporary corrections, Juniper thought, for now. The girl stayed a little while longer, drinking tea and warming her hands, before heading home with the carefully wrapped glow held close again, stronger now, better behaved. As the door closed behind her, Juniper felt the path shift. Not dramatically, not dangerously, but undeniably. Aloan leaned against the door and exhaled. "Do you ever feel like," she began, then shook her head. "Never mind." Juniper jumped onto the bench and pressed her forehead briefly against Aloan's arm. "Yes," Juniper thought, "I do." Evening crept in again, slow and blue and quiet. Candles were lit, supper warmed. Outside, stars sharpened in the cold sky. Juniper returned to her windowsill, watching the village settle once more. Somewhere beyond sight, something watched back, not hostile, not yet, but attentive. Paths crossed. Warmth moved. And Juniper, clever and patient and very much awake, remained exactly where she needed to be.